Hey there friends, David Lightbringer here, and I am happy to report to you that in the course of doing a 5-hour live stream with a couple of friends where we read literally every line of pretend history written about the Andal Conquest and the Andals in general, I think I've learned something. One would hope, right? So I think I've figured out why the Andals invaded Westeros, and also when, and how that correlates to all the medieval British history that George is kind of riffing off of here. And I thought it would be cool to put all of that in a video with a runtime that's less than, half a day. And thanks to everyone who came out, it was a great time. We did go deep. Thanks to Sean and Tim for helping me out. But yeah, I do think that I have distilled down my arguments about when the Andal Conquest happened, aka definitely after the Long Night. And this has been a subject of some amount of debate in the fandom, in certain corners of the fandom, really ever since I joined the fandom some 8 to 10 years ago. Ancient Andals theory, as I like to refer to it, has been around in some form for a while, and although I consider it sort of a shadow arch nemesis to my own Great Empire of the Dawn theory, I've never really taken it on directly. So if you're interested in my take on that, my effort to debunk the lies about the lies of the Andals, if you will, and I say this all in good fun, of course, then stick around for the second half of the video, and I'll attempt to lay out my best case for why I think the Andal Conquest happened when it did and how we can know that. Now, I do want to say that I have come to like the Andals a good bit more after doing all this research, and also researching the Anglo-Saxon history that George is again riffing off of, because I realized that the Andals are basically Vikings, and that does make them a little cooler. So while I can't say that I have been converted to Ancient Andals theory, quite the opposite, I am very excited to talk about them and present these ideas to you. Oh yes, and I think I've got the answer to the not so well-known trivia question: what was the first Valyrian steel sword present in Westeros? So that'll be a fun one. Look out for it somewhere in the video. Catch you by surprise. Anyways, thanks for clicking on this video, and let's get started. All right, so the World of Ice and Fire presents two basic ideas about what may have motivated the Andal petty kings and warlords to begin invading Westeros, beginning with the Vale and then expanding out to the Riverlands and Stormlands, and eventually the rest of southern Westeros below the neck. The first potential motivation is the sort of Andal mythology answer pertaining to Hugor Hill having a vision of a golden land amidst towering mountains, as it is recorded in the Seven-Pointed Star, which is of course the holy book of the Andal faith, and also their oldest book or set of writings overall. So this would be a sort of manifest destiny type legend, the kind of thing that is written to give a higher purpose to the actions of a leader or a people, with those actions being conquest most of the time. Coupled with this idea is the more practical notion of the Vale simply being a ripe target, as rich as it is beautiful, yet relatively thinly peopled, as we are told. The Maesters suggest that perhaps that was why the first Andal invaders chose to land there, when they crossed the narrow sea beneath the banners of their gods. So both of these answers are essentially the same. The Andal kings and warlords may have invaded the Vale because it was rich and ripe for the plucking. Whether their gods promised anything to anyone is fairly immaterial. Either way, the motive is the richness of the land. So the second potential motivation that may have driven the Andals to invade and conquer Westeros would be the reality of Valyrian expansion, conquest, and ambition. So the Maesters say after the fall of Gis in the 5th Giscari War, which took place approximately 5,000 years ago, the Valyrians began, quote, a great surge of conquest and colonization. Apparently the Rhoynar, who had something of a working truce with Valyria in those days, were functioning as something of a buffer zone between the Andals and the Valyrians, right up until the point where Valyria began building colonies and cities and towns on the Rhoyne itself. So as they moved up the river and more importantly across the river to the west side, the Andals began to feel threatened, and the Maesters even think that there may have been some skirmishes and battles at this time. They ultimately conclude with this account: so it is likely the Andals chose to flee rather than face the inevitable slavery that came with Valyrian conquest. They retreated to the Axe, the lands from which they had sprung, and when that did not protect them, they retreated farther north and west until they came to the sea. Some might have given up there and surrendered to their fate, and others still might have made their last stand. But many and more made ships and sailed in great numbers across the narrow sea to the lands of the first men in Westeros. This version of the story has the feel of a kind of desperate flight, almost as desperate as that of the Rhoynar, who of course would flee the wrath of the Dragon Lords a couple of eons later. So here the Andals are being driven back up the river and all the way back to their homeland at the Axe, and then back west all the way to the ocean, where they either swim or die. So sounds very dramatic, and maybe it went down like that. Or maybe I suspect it was something like a slower, less dramatic version of that, where the gradual expansion of Valyria put pressure on the Andal warlords and chieftains, who eventually did hear about a fairer land across the sea and decided to go ahead and skedaddle out of the warpath of Valyria. Because, as it turns out, migration is a key part of original Andal culture. This is something the Maesters tell us about at the beginning of their summary of Andal history. The Andals originated in the lands of the Axe, east and north of where Pentos now lies, though they were for many centuries a migratory people who did not remain in one place for long. From the heartlands of the Axe, a great spur of land surrounded on all sides by the shivering sea, they traveled south and west to carve out Andalos, the ancient realm the Andals ruled before they crossed the narrow sea. Andalos stretched from the Axe to what is now the Bravosian coastlands, and south as far as the flatlands and the Velvet Hills. The Andals brought iron weapons with them and suits of iron plates, against which the tribes that inhabited those lands could do little. One such tribe was the Hairy Men. Their name is lost, but they are still remembered in certain Pentoshi histories. So interestingly, the World of Ice and Fire, in their section on the grasslands, suggests that the Andal migration may have begun even further away than the Axe. So in that section about Sarnor and the Fisher Queens, they say that, not only do they think the first men may have arisen in the grasslands south of the Silver Sea, but also perhaps the Andals. Or I would say the ancestors of the Andals. It's likely that the Andal culture did begin on the Axe, but people always have to come from somewhere, so maybe the pre-Andals, if you will, may have come from the Silver Sea. So getting back to the topic of the Andals being a migratory people, I think it really helps to key into the real history that George is working off of here. Because the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who eventually invaded and conquered Britain, were originally Germanic tribes. And Germanic tribes tend to be fairly mobile. For example, the story of the fall of the Roman Empire, in a sense, can be told in the form of a map with a lot of Germanic tribes attached to a lot of arrows that zoom all over Europe, from England to Carthage to Rome to Constantinople. Some of those Germanic tribes were in turn driven west by the arrival of the Huns from the east, whom basically nobody wanted to fight. And I definitely think that could be what George is emulating, with the Valyrian threat either directly or indirectly encouraging the Andals to Vamonos from Andalos. But it's perhaps more important to understand that Germanic tribes simply tended to migrate from time to time. And it's the choice they sometimes made when presented with either a superior foe or the opportunity for conquest and plunder. Germanic tribes definitely did do some amount of farming, but they relied more on hunting and fishing, and they tended to live in smaller villages as opposed to larger towns. So if they want to migrate, there's really not a whole lot to leave behind, if you will. There's no huge castle that they're attached to, or no series of highly irrigated fields like in Mesopotamia that they would have been attached to. So they can just pick up and move. So it seems to be the same for the Andals, who conquered the native inhabitants of northwestern Essos as they moved into that area. Like the Germanic tribes, the Andals don't seem to have been united under any one king or ruler, or any kind of central authority, particularly during the Andal conquest of Westeros. Instead, they're better thought of as a collection of tribes or clans with similar traditions, who at times would fight against one another and at times would ally with one another. It was much the same situation with the first men when the Andals arrived, as the World of Ice and Fire explains. Moreover, the Vale and its surrounding peaks were divided into a score of petty kingdoms when the first Andals began wading ashore, with the seven-pointed star painted, or carved in some cases, on their chests. Riven by ancient enmities, the kings of the first men did not unite against the invaders when they first appeared, but rather made pacts and alliances with them, seeking to use the newcomers in their wars against one another. A familiar folly that was to be repeated time and time again as the Andals spread out across Westeros. So all of this is following English history pretty much to a T, as this was also exactly the situation with the native Celtic tribes of Britain when the Anglo-Saxons invaded. The Celtic British tribes had many old rivalries, and some did indeed hire the warlords to fight against their old, enemies from across the hill or the valley, not realizing the stakes of the larger culture clash that was taking place, or perhaps not feeling as invested in that culture clash as they were in their immediate political concerns and rivalries. Now, anyone that's even slightly familiar with the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain knows that the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes didn't just show up one day. The Saxons had been raiding English shores for a few centuries, and many Germanic tribal warriors had been hired or conscripted into the Roman army, which of course occupied Britain in the centuries leading up to the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Most crucially, it was one of the first post-Roman era would-be Celtic British kings, a fellow named King Vortigern, who made the mistake of inviting a couple of Saxon clans to Britain to help him fight the notorious and recalcitrant Picts up in the north. And this would be in exchange for lands that would be given to the Saxons in southeastern Britain, the areas known as Wessex, Sussex, and Essex today, because that's just West Saxons, South Saxons, and East Saxons, with East Anglia and England taking their names from the Angles. So the Saxons came, they took their land, and it does seem that they fought the Picts for a time, but sometime soon after the deal fell apart, and then it turns out Vortigern had invited the Lion into his own home, if you will. So just as the Andals used their foothold in the Vale to then expand out into the Riverlands and conquer the rest of Westeros south below the neck because King of the North, the Saxons used their foothold in southeastern Britain as a staging ground to invade and conquer the rest of Britain. And of course, they also summoned their friends, the Angles and the Jutes, over from Jutland, which is of course the Denmark Peninsula. And by the way, that does look a little bit like the axe, so maybe that's a geography map reference. But yeah, the Saxons got that foothold, they called their friends over, and the rest is history. And so, as we read through the Andal history in the big Andal livestream, it really did jump out to me when the narrative told us that a couple of first-man kings in the Vale did this exact thing. They made the monumental mistake of inviting Andal warlords across the narrow sea to Westeros. Tywin Shell and Jon Brightstone, both who claimed the title King of the Fingers, went so far as to pay Andal warlords to cross the sea, each thinking to use their swords against the other. Instead, the warlords turned upon their hosts. Within a year, Brightstone had been taken, tortured, and beheaded, and Shell roasted alive inside his own wooden long hall. An Andal knight named Corwin Corbray took the daughter of the former for his bride and the wife of the latter for his bedwarmer, and claimed the Fingers for his own, though Corbray, unlike many of his fellows, never named himself a king, preferring the more modest style of Lord of the Five Fingers. Yes, modest Corwin Corbray. That's what they called him. He's only Lord of the Five Fingers, not King of the Fingers. So, real salt of the earth kind of guy. And as we can see, this went about as well for Shell and Brightstone as it did for the British King Vortigern. So, could this, in fact, be the genesis of the Andal conquest? Perhaps it wasn't so much a vision from the Seven as it was the fact that these doofus first-man kings invited the Andals over and paid them in gold and showed them how rich their lands were and also thinly peopled. "I have seen a vision from the Lord," might have joked modest Corwin Corbray, Lord of the Five Fingers, as he stood in a mountain pass at one end of the Vale, beholding its richness and fingering the hilt of his dread Valyrian steel sword, Lady Forlorn. And speaking of modest Corwin Corbray, that brings us to our daily double, or whatever it is, the trivia question, the one about which Valyrian steel sword was the first to arrive in Westeros. So we are told that most of the Valyrian steel owned by the lords of the Seven Kingdoms flowed into Westeros in the century or two preceding the Doom, after Valyria had built a new trading outpost on Dragonstone. But apparently that is not the case for Lady Forlorn, the ancestral blade of House Corbray. According to the history, Lady Forlorn, Valyrian Steel Edition, is in the hands of Kyle Corbray at the famous Battle of Seven Stars, which takes place at the foot of the Giant's Lance in the Vale. And that means that the Corbrays brought Lady Forlorn with them from Andalos. According to the Maesterly account of history, this is not a situation like the ancestral blade of House Stark, Ice, which is a name that goes back to the Age of Heroes that is then conferred on blade after blade all the way up until the present time, when Ned's ancestor bought a Valyrian steel sword some 400 years ago and gave it the older title of Ice. So it's not like that. This is the Valyrian steel Lady Forlorn in the hands of the Corbrays when they crossed the sea to Westeros, however many thousands of years ago, and we will get to that very shortly. This suggests that the Andals did have some contact with the Valyrians while still in Andalos. Some Corbray ancestor, or perhaps some other Andal, must have bought Lady Forlorn from the Valyrians while they were still there, or perhaps somebody may have even won it from a Valyrian in a battle, maybe one of those skirmishes between the Andals and the Valyrians that the maesters speculate may have happened. This means that Lady Forlorn is pretty likely to have been the first Valyrian steel sword in Westeros, not counting Dawn, of course, which is like Valyrian steel but seems to have a more mysterious origin, I would suggest with the Great Empire of the Dawn. But yeah, Dawn is kind of its own thing, so the first official Valyrian steel sword in Westeros probably was Lady Forlorn. And while all Valyrian steel swords have pretty cool names, Nightfall is one of my favorites, Lady Forlorn might be the most badass. The lady only comes out when she has a thirst, you know. A thirst for blood. This also means that the Andal conquest of Westeros cannot have taken place before the Valyrians learned how to make Valyrian steel. And although we don't know when Valyria started doing that, and actually this piece of information establishes a potential earliest date for Valyrian steelmaking, we do know that Valyria arose after the Long Night and not before. So yeah, the Andals couldn't have left Andalos until after they acquired this Valyrian steel sword, Lady Forlorn, from the Valyrians. So our other first man, King Vortigern, if you will, was a king by the name of Osgood Shett, third of his name, ruler of Gulltown. We are told that this Osgood Shett claimed the ancient, vainglorious title King of the True Men, a style that supposedly went back 10,000 years to the Dawn Age. So this is a great parallel to King Vortigern, who was essentially a warlord styling himself as King of the Britons, whose rule not everyone accepted. And some historical sources say that King Vortigern was a bit of a tyrant, and also some historians think he didn't exist at all. So, yeah, and whether he existed or not specifically, people like him did exist. So, anyway, here is the setup with Osgood Shett, King of the True Men. The Shetts of Gulltown have a long-running feud with their neighbors, the Bronze Kings of Runestone, from which House Royce descends, and you can see how close they are here. They really, really are neighbors. A fellow called Yorwick Royce VI claims the runic crown of Royce kingship. And at the time of the Andal conquest, he had been king for 3 years, and he's been sticking it to the Shetts in several battles in the no man's land between the two castles. Gulltown has thick walls and is secure from attack, but Osgood doesn't like losing all the territory outside of his castle. And that is when Osgood Shett makes the huge mistake of hiring Andal warlords from Andalos. Most glaringly, this was after the Shell and Brightstone debacle. Remember, beheaded, tortured, burned alive in his own long haul. But Osgood Shett, he knows better. He's going to do it right. He's going to make it work where it didn't work for other people. Let's see how that turned out. Unwisely, King Osgood turned to Andalos for help in recovering all that he had lost. Thinking to avoid the fate of Shell and Brightstone, he sought to bind his allies to him with blood in place of gold. He gave his daughter in marriage to the Andal knight Gerald Grafton, took Sir Gerald's eldest daughter for his own bride, and married a younger daughter to his son and heir. All the marriages were performed by septons, according to the rites of the Seven from across the sea. Shett even went so far as to convert to the faith himself, swearing to build a great sept in Gulltown should the Seven grant him victory. Then he sallied forth with his Andal allies to meet the Bronze King. King Osgood won his victory, as it happened, but he himself did not survive the battle, and afterward it was whispered amongst the Gulltowners and other first men that it was Sir Gerald himself who struck him down. Upon his return to the town, the Andal warlord claimed his good father's crown for his own, dispossessing the younger Shett and confining him to his bedchamber until such time as he had gotten Sir Gerald's daughter with child, after which the father vanishes from the pages of history. When Gulltown rose against him, King Gerald put down the protests brutally, and soon the gutters of the town ran red with the blood of the first men, and women and children as well. The dead were thrown into the bay to feed the crabs. In the years that followed, the rule of House Grafton remained uncontested, for, surprisingly, Sir Gerald proved a sage and clever ruler, and the town prospered greatly under him and his successors, growing to be the first and only city of the Vale. Oh man, so close, so close to having that work out. But in the end, the story is the same. Another Andal warlord, this time Gerald Grafton, has supplanted a first-man king and now rules his lands. And rules them well, it seems, apart from a few massacres at the beginning, just to sort of get people in line. But after that, the tax policy was... So despite the barbarity and potential treachery of this takeover, what we see when we zoom out is that Gerald Grafton's future child will be half Shett, meaning half first man and half Andal, and so too for the children of his daughter, who was gotten with child by the younger usurped Prince Shett, who disappears from the pages of history. I'm sure they gave him a tower, maybe Pebble, Littlefinger's tower no, they killed him. They probably killed him. But yeah, the point is the Graftons going forward would be culturally Andal, but genetically they're going to be half First Men and half Andal. And that's going to be the case in most of these places around the Seven Kingdoms. And by the way, this is also exactly how the British history unfolded. And in fact, it's typical of history in general, and George uses this all over the place. So for example, Orys Baratheon, the bastard half-brother of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. He defeated Argilac Durrandon, the last Storm King, then married his daughter, took the Durrandon castle and sigil and regalia for his own, and presto, there you go. House Baratheon is born, but they're just going to be half Durrandon, and culturally, all the way Durrandon. So yeah, sometimes the culture shift goes one way or the other, but intermarriage is how the ties are bound, because after periods of war and chaos and conflict, people are always eager to return to some kind of peace and normalcy. So quite often you'd have these marriage alliances between former foes, especially if the new coming invaders or conquerors are intending to stay and rule and not just pillage, plunder, and go back home. Marrying the son or daughter of the old line of kings is, of course, how you confer that authority and legitimacy onto yourself if you're a barbarian warlord. I myself am a YouTuber. It's much safer. And so, returning to the question of what was the primary motivation for the Andal invasion, it's a little bit hard to say if the World of Ice and Fire narrative is suggesting that the Andals named Corbray and Grafton, who were invited over by the First Men, were the first Andals to arrive in the Vale. It might be implying that, and I think it is, because the story of Shell and Brightstone is the first paragraph of specific detail about the conquest that immediately follows the opening paragraph that introduces the conquest in general. It also tells us that the Fingers were the first place that the Andals landed, and that is exactly the land that Shell and Brightstone were contesting over. Remember, they were trying to be the king of the Fingers. It definitely does say that Kings Shell and Brightstone did pay Andal warlords to cross the sea. So they weren't hiring Andals that were already there on the Fingers. And if there were Andals that had already been there on the Fingers, one would assume Shell and Brightstone would have hired them. So perhaps there were no Andals on the Fingers yet until they reached across the sea to Andalos. And that would lead us to conclude that it may have been Shell and Brightstone who began the Andal conquest by literally inviting them over. Way to go, guys. Way to go. Now, it may still be that the Valyrians were putting pressure on the Andals, and in fact, none of these potential motivations for the migration are really in conflict with one another. Like why were so many Andal chieftains so eager to come over to Westeros once they heard that there was plunder and land for conquest? Was it purely because the Vale was fat and rich? Or was it that plus this looming shadow of Valyrian expansion? I would guess that it was probably a little bit of both, but it does seem that the kings Shell, Brightstone, and Shett, Osgood Shett, essentially gave the Andals the solution to their problems by paying them in gold to come over to Westeros. So again, way to go, guys, way to go. And then at the risk of stating the obvious, the fact that the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain also began with this King Vortigern or whoever inviting the Saxons over and paying them to fight their rivals makes it very likely that George is in fact trying to recreate a similar dynamic here with these First Man kings, and that this is how the Andal invasion started. The other factor to consider here is that the Andals had long been a culture possessing maritime capability, and because of this, they were far from ignorant of Westeros before they invaded. This is only referred to one time, but it really did jump out to me on the reread. So in the Dornish history section of the World of Ice and Fire, it says that the Andals made their mark on Dorne, as they did on all Westeros south of the Neck. Yet most historians agree that their impact was less here than in any of the other southern kingdoms. Unlike the First Men, the Andals were seafarers, and the more adventurous of their captains knew the Dornish coasts well, and were wont to say that there was naught to be found there but snakes, scorpions, and sand. Small wonder then that comparatively few of the invaders spent their oars southward when there were richer, greener lands far closer at hand, just across the narrow sea from Andalos itself. All right, so this is pretty interesting. Presumably, these more adventurous Andal captains are sailing around the coastline of Dorne to trade at places like Old Town and Lannisport, or perhaps even to raid the coastal settlements of the First Men, just as the Saxons were raiding the coastline of Britain before they invaded properly. If these Andal captains were sailing around Dorne enough to know the coastline, quote, well, then that means they were sailing all over the place, and certainly all over the Narrow Sea. So the Andals definitely would have had some knowledge of the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands, etc., before the actual invasion. They may well have had some contacts in Westeros. That's what happens when you trade. And after all, how did Kings Shell and Brightstone know to send over to Andalos for these warlords? Because they knew they were there, because they knew of their prowess, and because obviously they had some way of contacting them. So yeah, there was already contact between Westeros and Andalos happening before the invasion. Of course, it's not that big of an ocean. And more to the point, the Andals are seafarers, and they are apparently sailing all over the place even before the invasion. So there you have it, the motivation and causation of the Andal conquest of Westeros, as best as I can determine it. And now let's debunk Ancient Andals theory. And I hope you realize I'm kind of kidding when I say this stuff. These theories are fun. All this is fun. So, I don't know. I'm just trying to present my argument. I hope you guys will watch it and enjoy it and make up your minds for yourselves. All right, part 2, second half. So guys, one thing I do want to make clear, I'm not actually debunking anyone's videos. I didn't watch all the ancient Andal videos that are out there and address all their arguments specifically. I'm not trying to attack anybody. What I'm trying to do is present my argument for why I think the Andals arrived in Westeros after the Long Night, more or less in the time period that the histories think they did. And so the clues that help us date the Andal invasion or migration begin in Essos, as I mentioned already. The very first named Andal warlord to cross the Narrow Sea, as we read, was modest Corwin Corbray, and he had that Valyrian steel sword with him. That necessitates that the Andal conquest happened not only sometime after the original formation of Valyria, but also after the point at which the Valyrian civilization had learned the art of working steel and had discovered the magic spells needed to make Valyrian steel. The World of Ice and Fire also uses the advent of steelmaking to date the Andal invasion to Westeros as follows. The fact that the Andals forged iron has been taken by some as proof that the Seven guided them, that the smith himself taught them this art, and so do the holy texts teach. But the Rhoynar were already an advanced civilization at this time, and they too knew of iron. So it only takes the study of a map to realize that the earliest Andals must have had contact with the Rhoynar. The Darkwash and the Noin lay directly in the path of the Andals' migration, and there are remnants of Rhoynish outposts in Andalos, according to the Norvashi historian Doro Golathis. And it would not be the first time that men learned of the working of iron from the Rhoynar. It is said that the Valyrians learned the art from them as well, although the Valyrians eventually surpassed them. Alright, so according to the Maesterly Chronology, Rhoynish civilization is already great by the time the Andals are migrating across northwestern Essos to eventually reach what would become Andalos. Part of the evidence supporting that conclusion is this fact that older Rhoynish outposts can apparently be found in the land that was taken over by the Andals, which means the Rhoynish were obviously there first. If this chronology is correct, then they are probably also correct in assuming that the Andals learned steelmaking from the Rhoynish. When the Maesters say, "It is said that the Valyrians learned how to work steel from the Rhoynar," the "it is said" there would be a reference to the Valyrian histories themselves, which the Maesters were well familiar with because they often traveled to Valyria to consult their histories specifically. Therefore, the idea that the Valyrians learned steelmaking from the Rhoynar seems pretty reliable. We're told by the World of Ice and Fire that for thousands of years, the Andals abided in Andalos, growing in number. And part of the evidence for that conclusion would be the many towns and fortifications and other ruins that the Andals apparently left behind all over Andalos. It takes time, obviously, for a civilization to develop to that size and to leave such a large footprint on a territory as large as Andalos is described as being. So far, this history all fits together pretty well. The Andals seem to have moved into Andalos after the Rhoynish civilization was already established, and after the land that would become Andalos was already populated with other native inhabitants that, of course, the Andals either put to the sword or absorbed. At some point early in their history, the Andals seem to have learned the art of steel making from the Rhoynish, and later, after the point at which the Valyrians were able to make Valyrian steel, someone bought or acquired the Valyrian steel sword Lady Forlorn. Then, finally, the Andals were invited across the Narrow Sea by our first man Vortigern's. Now, Ancient Andals theory would have us believe that all of this happened before the Long Night, but that simply doesn't line up with the rest of this SOC history that we've been given. So one other note on the chronology real quick, you'll notice that I'm not often using numbered dates, but rather talking about when events took place in relation to one another. That's because the oldest reliable fixed date for anything seems to be that 5th Giscari War, which took place around 5000 BC. That was a huge landmark event that was attested to by multiple cultures, including the literate Giscari and the literate Valyrians, with the Maesters, again, having had lots of access to the Valyrian history and being well familiar with it. So before that point, we only have wildly speculative round number dates for anything. So for example, the first man crossing the Arm of Dorne, the Maesters say, may have happened anywhere from 12 to 8,000 years ago. The Long Night may have happened 12 or 8 or even 6,000 years ago, and the Andal Conquest may have happened 4 or 2,000 years ago, and so on. Hey y'all, it's Safety First Anti-Glare Glasses video editor David Lightbringer, just popping in to say, if you look in the Ice and Fire wiki, it does say that some people say that the Andal Invasion was up to 6,000 years ago, but that turns out to be a reference only to the myth of Alyssa Arryn, who, because her name is thought to be Arryn, the logic goes that perhaps that's a clue that the Andals were already here 6,000 years ago. But the more obvious conclusion is, like many other myths that the Maesters talk about, the Arryns Andalized it after they got there. This happened with the building of Storm's End. 7 times he tried to rebuild the castle. This is an obvious Andalization of an earlier myth, and that's almost certainly the case with Alyssa Arryn. So I didn't include that as a potential date for the Andal Invasion, sorry, but it's not a reference to the Andal Invasion, so yeah. Therefore, it seems more useful to speak of things happening before or after the Long Night, or before or after Valyria was established, before or after steelmaking spread throughout Essos, and so on. And then there's the thorny issue of the highly irregular seasons that this planet experiences, leading different cultures to keep track of years differently, and thus have totally different chronologies. This is referred to briefly in the World of Ice and Fire, but is not often discussed in the fandom. One issue that plagues all studies of the ancient records is how differently the varied cultures reckon days and seasons and years. Archmaester Walgrim's great work, The Reckoning of Time, delves deeply into this problem, but there is little consensus on what the dates we have actually mean in our own reckoning. So here's what they're referring to. With these irregular seasons that Martin's planet experiences, the only way to accurately measure a year, which is of course the length of time it takes for a planet to move all the way around the sun and complete one orbit, is with astronomy, by observing the stars. And ancient cultures certainly were capable of this basic level of astronomy, and it does seem that the Maesters are using astronomy to fairly accurately keep track of the length of a year. However, as they say, it is probably difficult to understand how ancient cultures in particular counted the years, and in some cases even just foreign cultures. So now let's talk about the topic of writing. The Maesters tell us that the Andals were among the very first literate societies, which means that they probably had writing even while in Andalos. Speaking of the Dawn Age, the Maesters say, "What little is known to us of those days is contained in the oldest of texts, the tales written down by the Andals, by the Valyrians, and by the Giscari, and even by those distant people of fabled Ashai. Yet however ancient these lettered races, they were not even children during the Dawn Age. So what truths their tales contain are difficult to find, like seeds among chaff." Alright, so Giscari record-keeping, meaning writing, presumably would have been developed before their empire was destroyed, as opposed to being developed by the highly decimated remnant of the Giscari people whom the Valyrians left among the salted fields to eventually resettle Slaver's Bay. That means that Gis, and probably Valyria, were already literate by 5000 BC. And the Andals are, as you just heard, grouped by the Maesters with those two civilizations, as having the, quote, oldest of texts. This lends a lot of credibility to the Andal account of history, in my opinion. And to be honest, I think some of the ancient Andal theories are saying that all of this history is essentially faked, like it's a big conspiracy. As I mentioned, I can't claim to be familiar with every single ancient Andals argument that's been made, but you would kind of have to allege a giant conspiracy like that, simply because the Andals have been writing things down since they were in Andalos. Of course, the big issue with this is that Andal history intersects with other people's history, which the Andals don't have control over. The maesters of the modern era are consulting with as many different histories as they can, and they also mention the earliest histories of the various Valyrian freeholder cities as being good sources of what was going on before the freehold expanded to that area. So taken together with their consultation of the Valyrian histories and other histories, the web of lies and deceit that would need to be woven in order for Andal history to be fabricated and phony would extend well beyond the scope of Andal civilization. That's just too big a lift for me, and I am open to conspiracies, but that seems to be a heavy lift. And I'll also point out that the Andals were never a united people, either in Andalos or in Westeros. So these earliest Andal histories would have been written down by different warlords and by their individual septons and maesters and wise men. So it just doesn't seem possible, to me anyway, let me know what you think, for Andal history to be entirely fabricated and false. Another piece of evidence related to Andal record keeping is the fact that they apparently do not have any records of the Long Night, instead referring to accounts of the Long Night from the ancient Rhoynar, Yitish, Ashai, and of course the First Men. This suggests that what we would call Andal culture functionally did not exist at the time of the Long Night. At this point, their ancestors were probably somewhere in the grasslands, with the cultural identity of Andal being centuries off in the future. That cohesive Andal cultural identity probably arose in the lands of the Axe, since that's where the Andals think that they are from. But the point is that they would have some sort of cultural memory of the Long Night if the Andals existed as a cohesive people when the Long Night occurred. This argument gets even worse for Ancient Andals theory, again in my opinion, when you consider that they want to put Andals in Westeros before the Long Night. If the Andals had been in Westeros, where the Long Night was the worst, then they definitely would have some sort of written record of the Great Darkness and the Ice Demons, of the Purge, as it were, just as they have written records of their conquest of Westeros and even their migration through Andalos. Instead, the Seven-Pointed Star, which is their oldest book, apparently contains no mention of the Long Night, or else the maesters would say so when they list all the places where they have been able to find records of the Long Night. Then we have the issue of corroboration of Andal history with the physical evidence in Westeros, as well as the runic records of the First Men, with those runes on rocks, as it is said, of course being meant to emulate Norse, Celtic, and Germanic runic inscriptions. So, speaking of the Age of Heroes, the maesters say, "The tales we have now are the work of septons and maesters writing thousands of years after the fact. Yet, unlike the children of the forest and the giants, the first men of this Age of Heroes left behind some ruins and ancient castles that can corroborate parts of the legends. And there are stone monuments in the barrow fields and elsewhere marked with their runes. It is through these remnants that we can begin to ferret out the truth behind these tales." So, if the maesters are able to use the physical evidence of the runic inscriptions of the First Men to ferret out the truth of what happened during the Age of Heroes, this would be all the more true of the Andal Conquest, that the written records of the Andals, passed down through time to the maesters, could be verified to some extent by physical evidence and these runic inscriptions. So they'd find inscriptions that attest to the invasion of the Andals, and they'd probably talk about what First Man kings may have ruled during the invasion, people like Tywin Shell, John Brightstone, and of course, Osgood Shett III. So this problem basically just gets worse and worse as we progress through the regional history of the Seven Kingdoms. In every place, the maesters claim to know which First Man kings were alive at the time, and which ones fought the Andals, and which ones married the Andals, and what their daughters' names were. And these First Man kings fighting and receiving the Andals definitely don't seem to be like the oldest First Man kings, or anything even close to that. For example, the Andal invaders didn't clash with any Casterlys of the Rock, but rather a King Tybolt Lannister, the Thunderbolt. And the maesters think this occurred thousands of years after the Lannisters had supplanted the Casterlys. Now, they do of course mention that Lan the Clever himself may have been an early pre-conquest Andal adventurer. And that could actually be true, because remember, some of the more adventurous Andal captains were already sailing around Dorne to the Westerlands before the invasion. So yeah, Lan the Clever could be an Andal, and if he's not an Andal, he's probably from the Great Empire of the Dawn. Either one could actually work there, but the point is that this would be a one-off. This is long before the Andal Conquest, because when the Conquest happened in truth, the Andals met Lannister kings who had already been consolidating their power and growing wealthy for centuries. And on it goes. So in the Riverlands, the Andals met the fabled last king of House Mud, Christopher IV, the Hammer of Justice, who ruled the Riverlands from the Castle Oldstones on the Blue Fork of the Trident. The Muds were not the first ruling family of the Riverlands, though, as the World of Ice and Fire tells us. Before the Muds, there had been other kings near as powerful. The Fishers are said in some chronicles to have been the first and oldest line of river kings. In others, they are accounted the second dynasty, and the fragmentary Annals of the Rivers from the ancient septary at Peasdale suggests they were third. The Blackwoods and Brackens both claim to have ruled the Riverlands at various times during the Age of Heroes. Alright, so before the Muds, there may have been 3 or more dynasties in the Riverlands. House Fisher, House Blackwood, House Bracken, and perhaps some other that's lost to memory. This ancient historical record that the Maesters referred to called Annals of the Rivers, which is apparently from some ancient sept, presumably a ruined sept called Peasdale. Well, this would be a very old Andal account. It was found in a sept, after all. So this is a written record from early in the days of the Andal Conquest, and the earlier First Man history that it is recording would have been oral history that the First Men would have given to these first Andals in the Riverlands. Thus, it seems pretty reliable insofar as it is telling us that a lot of Riverlands history went down before the Andals invaded and, unfortunately, defeated good old Christopher IV, Hammer of Justice, in his 100th battle, apparently. He had 99 victories and then a problem with the last one. Then we have the Stormlands, which was ruled by Eric Durndon VIII, called Eric the Unready. Gosh, guess what happened here? But it was actually his grandson, Carlton Durndon II, who was the first Durndon king to fight the Andals. Then we hear of at least 3 more Durndon kings, Carlton III, Monford V, and Baldric I, called the Cunning, before we finally get to a fellow named King Durin Durndon the 21st. And look, I know the Durndons have a lot of kings named Durin, and the Maesters aren't sure about some of the older ones and which ones did what, but this is King Durin the 21st. So before the arrival of the Andals under the reign of King Eric VIII, we would have had 7 previous Eric Durndon kings, 20 previous Durin Durndon kings, 4 Monfords that ruled before Monford V, a Carlton, a Baldric the Cunning, and who knows who else. And so right there, that's 32 Durndon kings who reigned before Eric VIII and the arrival of the Andals. And this again just kind of makes it seem like, a lot of history went down in Westeros before the Andals arrived. So it's the same story in the Iron Islands and the Reach, where the arrival of the Andals intersects with their local history after a great many kings and dynasties had already come and gone. I won't belabor the point by reciting it all. That's what the 5-hour Andal stream is for. And really, it's just more of the same. All of the history that is attributed to the Dawn Age and the Age of Heroes, and then some, has already come and gone before the Andals arrive in Westeros. Now, if I were trying to construct an ancient Andals theory, or more accurate, let's say if I was looking for things, which I am, that may cut against all the evidence I've already presented, I might take a look at the 2 times that First Man kings apparently went seeking for the aid of the Children of the Forest to help them fight the Andals. Just as the last hero, of course, is said to have sought out the aid of the Children of the Forest to fight against the others. Those kings who sought out the children were the King Durin Durndon the 21st of the Stormlands that we just mentioned, and a King Gwaine Gardner IV of the Reach. The line about King Gwaine, called the Gods Fearing, tells us only that he sought the children, but not that anything came of it, and presumably this is because the kings in the Reach chose peace treaties and intermarriages with the Andals over battle. However, Durin the 21st, well, he was successful. He found the children and he formed something called the Weirwood Alliance, which fought and defeated the Andals in several historical battles at places such as Black Bog, Misty Wood, and the Howling Hill. So the pro-Ancient Andals idea here would be something like, perhaps these seemingly newer stories about seeking out the children to fight the Andals are actually the same as the last hero legend, just scrambled up a bit in time and place, and perhaps this indicates that the Andals were present when the last hero was seeking out help from the children against the others. That doesn't really make sense, though, to me, both because that's just a lot to be happening all at one time, and more so because none of the Andal records of the Conquest mention any kind of great darkness or ice demons. And it does have record of these battles against the Weirwood Alliance. So what, did the last hero seek out the children and then form an army and fight a bunch of battles against the Andals before going north to fight the others? That doesn't seem right to me. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Andals themselves have no cultural memory of the Long Night. So what makes a lot more sense to me is that these gods-fearing kings, Gawain IV and Durin the 21st, are simply remembering the story of the last hero and trying to seek out the help of the children to face a threat that must have seemed nearly as dire as the others did. So just like when Bran hears about Benjen being lost north of the wall and goes, oh, maybe the children will help him, that's pretty much what would have been going on here. Gawain IV and Durin the 21st pretty much said, maybe the children will help us. We also know that the first men fought together with the children of the forest at the High Heart against the Andals, losing in a great bloody battle where all those Weirwoods were chopped down afterward, sadly. And that's why I'm wearing my tree chopping shirt. Congratulations if you put that together already. So in other words, this was just something that was happening at this time. First men and children of the forest aligned together to fight the Andals. And of course that makes sense because the first men had come to worship the old gods of the Weirwood by this time, whereas the Andals were chopping the trees down. And there you have it, folks. I'm sure I didn't address every single argument made in favor of Ancient Andals theory, but I do think some of those other arguments boil down to misunderstanding the Great Empire of the Dawn presence in Westeros and mistaking it for Andal presence. Because there are certainly clues that somebody more advanced than the First Men was around in the Dawn Age, really, like well before the Long Night, and perhaps even before the arrival of the First Men. But again, I would argue that those are people coming from the Great Empire of the Dawn, and if you want to check out my arguments about that, you might try videos such as Origins of Old Town, Dragon Lords of Ancient Ashai, and Great Empire of the Dawn, Westeros. Oh yes, and the Grey King video, and all the subsequent Ironborn playlist videos, if you really want to go there. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you feel that I have been fair and trying to look at the evidence here. Do let me know what you think. I'm curious to hear your feedback, including from you Ancient Andals believers. Feel free to open the dialogue. It's all fun and games here. It's all love. I even let those RLJ heretic deniers hang out, it's all good. Maybe Great Empire of the Dawn theory is cracked, I mean, it is kind of one or the other, Great Empire of the Dawn or Ancient Andals, so that will leave you to be the judge. So again, thanks very much for watching, and if you want to support the ongoing existence of this YouTube channel, then consider joining as a YouTube channel member squisher with the join button, the red join button below the video. Or you can check out our Patreon campaign with the Patreon link in the description below the video.